never had that chance. It was because of what happened here 80 years ago of this. And you can look at history, you can look at the integration, and you look at the progress that has happened ever since. The presence of you all today is a testament that there is hope, that when people work together, that the great things can happen. I remember several conversations with Mr. Bilorski of the Treasure Island Museum. This was one of his life's passion as well. He wanted to make sure that on Yerba Buena Island, there is a public place for representation, for visibility, and I commend the Treasure Island commissioners and staff for ensuring that this place that we have today is a reality. Where do we go from here? Well, I heard that there is going to be a permanent memorial for the 50 sailors. That's very comforting to me. And why is that? Even though the disaster happened 80 years ago, but look at what has happened ever since. Is it a coincidence that on July 17, 2024, that the 50 sailors were exonerated? And here we are, October 24th, 2024, and the banners in honor of the 50 sailors are going to be unveiled. I think it's a divine purpose. And so to all the families that have endured all this time, and for those of their members that have moved on, be rest assured that justice might take some time, but ultimately there are good people in the world, like the people sitting here today, that make things happen. And so as we develop this beautiful place, iconic Treasure Island, Yerba Buena Island, and like I said, we just started. This is going to be a point of destination. I envision that millions of people visiting San Francisco would take the time to come out here, see the beautiful sculpture of Mr. Sujimoto. There's no other place like that in the world. And that they will pause while they're here and look at these panels. And that children, school children and adults will come out and learn about the history. That is what we are doing here. We can build a whole city within a city that we are doing here. But for me and my colleagues on Tyler, today is a historic day. It's an important day. And I salute you all. And to the Treasure Island Museum, Mike, I know you work so hard behind the scenes. And may God bless you all. Thank you for this opportunity. Thank you for your time.
Chicago Naval Magazine National Award. Remember Port Chicago? You should. These words were printed in an NAACP pamphlet in 1945 in an attempt to overturn the Port Chicago Mutiny Convention. So why should we remember Port Chicago? Because it is a story of America. A story of struggle and resistance, oppression, perseverance, change, and one where we can clearly and plainly see the dangers of segregation and discrimination. The disaster at the Port Chicago Naval Magazine on July 17, 1944 did not need to happen. It should not have happened. 320 men should not have died. 390 should not have been injured. The town of Port Chicago should not have been severely damaged. And the men who were concerned for their safety should not have been put on trial for mutiny. But they were, and the disaster did happen. So what can we do about it today? On the night of July 17, 1944, the Bay Area shook. Over 10 million pounds of explosives had gone off. Hundreds of lives were lost, and hundreds more were changed forever. Port Chicago Naval Magazine was a vitally important link in the Pacific theater of World War II. Virtually all of the ammunition being used in the Pacific came through here. But this base was segregated. So the young and eager sailors who wanted to answer the call to avenge Pearl Harbor were black and were severely limited in their role in the Navy. African Americans could ship out and be at sea, but they would not be fighting. They'd be serving food to those fighting on the front lines or moving their laundry. Or, in the case of the men of Fort Chicago, they were tasked with loading ammunition. Only, they weren't trained. They weren't given safety procedures or even an education on what types of explosives they were handling. They were simply told to load and shouted at to go faster. There were warnings and appeals for safety to be prioritized, but the Navy willfully ignored them, resulting in the worst home front disaster of World War II. But the story of Port Chicago continued, because despite this horrific accident, which the official inquiry did determine was an accident, the black sailors were blamed. And then they were told to return to work as if nothing had happened and without additional training. So they said no. And in response, the Navy tried and convicted them of mutiny, forever labeling them as the Port Chicago 50. These men wanted what everyone wants: to have a safe working environment and to be treated equally and fairly, but they were denied these things. The NAACP pamphlet ended with a plea that the pointless, meaningless life or meaningless death of over 320 Americans be given a point, a meaning. And so, 80 years later, we are doing that. The Secretary of the Navy took a huge step on July 17th, 2024, when he exonerated the sailors. We give meaning every time we give tours of the memorial, the location where those men died. We are giving meaning today with these panels, and we give meaning every time we talk about Port Chicago. We give meaning so that we can have a different response when asked, "Remember Port Chicago?" We will say, "We do." Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Jonathan Lee, and I'm an active practicing attorney, but I'm here in a different capacity. As a volunteer, I'm a director of the Contra Costa County Bar Association, and I've also, for the last 2.5 years, served as the chair of the Port Chicago Task Force for the Bar Association. I'm going to focus my remarks on the trial itself. Just a brief timeline. Of course, the disaster happened on July 17th. The court of inquiry that Hurley referred to took evidence until July 31st. By August the 12th, the command here had issued a memorandum to D.C. recommending legal charges against the 50. So that's 26 days after the disaster. The rest of August, the prosecution team gathered statements from both the Port Chicago 50 group as well as the 208 who went back to work. And the 208 were tried in summary court martial. We're already talking about that. We're now going to talk about the general court martial. The charges were drafted and signed on September the 4th, and the trial commenced on September the 14th of 1944. There were 33 days of trial proceedings, and the trial proceedings concluded on October 24th, 1944, making today the 80th anniversary of the day of the verdict into the court. The prosecution called about 50 witnesses in its case in chief, and the two main witnesses were the two commanders, Commander Tobin and Lieutenant who established that the 50 men refused to go back to work. That was the evidence of the case in chief. The defense put on a case. They called about 60 witnesses. Each of the defendants testified each of the 50 members of the Port Chicago 50, standing as defendants in trial, took the stand. The prosecution then put on a rebuttal case of about 10 witnesses, so we had 120 witnesses roughly in 33 days of trial. A transcript that was 1,500 pages long. And the court deliberated on the merits of the charges for approximately 80 minutes. The guilty verdicts were rendered on October 24th, as I mentioned. And I want to tell you about some of the due process violations. There are many that we could talk about. We selected a few from a study of the transcript. Probably the first and arguably the most important of these is that the 50 defendants had 5 lawyers to represent them. So every lawyer was charged with defending 10 defendants. In a capital case where death is on the table as a potential penalty, that is something that even under then existing Supreme Court law offended due process. There were evidentiary rulings before trial that really tilted the proceeding in favor of the prosecution. For example, the prosecution was allowed to elicit evidence of statements by people that weren't identifiable. The witness could not tell you who the statement was made by. So an unattributed witness, a hearsay statement, was received as evidence supporting a charge of conspiracy by the 50 defendants. Conspiracy requires proof of an agreement to commit a crime. The actual agreement is the crime, not the doing of the act. So this evidence was instrumental in supporting the prosecution's theory, and it was also inconsistent with Supreme Court precedent at the time. By contrast, the defense was not permitted, because the court ruled that it was irrelevant, to offer evidence of the working conditions before the disaster. So that meant that they couldn't offer evidence of the warnings that some of the very men charged with movement had given to the officers about the dangers of the operations. I'm thinking of Joseph R. Small Sr. in particular. I feel like today is an option to mention. The defense was not allowed to offer evidence of the regulations that govern the related ammunition and required safety training and safety procedures. None of that was relevant according to the court. Basically, the defense was not allowed to offer evidence that was exculpatory, that were intended to point to the innocence of the man on a number of fronts. To commit mutiny, of course, you have to have a state of mind on the charges for authority, and there was ample evidence to establish that the man did not have that state of mind. Protesting working conditions, not meant to take I also want to mention briefly, since his descendants are here today, Cyril Shepard testified, and he explained that before he came to Port Chicago, he had been a gunnersman for 7 years, and he was able to fight the enemy as a gunnersman. He described under oath that he never received an order to prepare ammunition for the disaster. He was aware of orders such as "will you obey any order given?" Pretty vague, amorphous statements like that, but not a specific order to load ammunition. He also was shown his statement attributed to him, which is a typewritten document, and it wasn't one that he saw typed or prepared and cited because he was told he had to. But under oath, he identified that the words used on the typewritten document were not the words that he used in the interview that he gave to the prosecution team. So these are just a few glimpses into the trial to help you understand the conclusion that we reached in the Bar Association and the task force was that this trial was a carefully curated and constructed proceeding that had only one possible outcome, and that was the conviction of each of the 50. Of course, that has now been undone, and the Secretary of the Navy's order actually says that the charges themselves are dismissed. So the case no longer exists. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. Good morning, everyone. My name is Ryan Thomas Brown. I'm the Deputy District Director for Congressman Mark DeSaulnier. I have with me the Senior District Representative for Congressman Darren Preet. It is an honor to be here on behalf of the Congressman. We've heard a little bit about the national park side, the family side, the legal side. This was a process that, as stated before, took many, many different groups of people to come together, and we'll speak very briefly about the political side. The Congressman was one of many members of Congress that worked together to have the Port Chicago 50 exonerated, starting with Congressman Buena, with the assistance of Congressman Lee, Congressman DeSanto, and now with the redistricting Congressman Yerba involved as well. The fact that it took that many members of Congress and this much community support truly shows the extent of how important it was for this exoneration to happen. I do have a very brief letter from the Congressman that I'd like to read for all of you, and I'll turn it over to my colleague Henry. Dear friends, it is with great pride that our office is here today in honor of the lives of the crewmen and courageous survivors of the Port Chicago Naval Magazine explosion and their families. We are proud that after 80 years, these heroes have finally been fully exonerated. We were proud to carry that torch and build on the work of Congressman Miller, Congresswoman Lee, and Congressman Garamendi for the convicted sailors, their families, and the community for the many decades of fighting that it took to get to this point. We are grateful for the Navy for heeding the call, and the fight to correct these injustices were very long, but hope was never lost that one day it would be resolved. Acknowledging our nation's past is critical to building a brighter future. We all remain committed to sharing the story of Port Chicago 50 now and forever, and to continue the work and build upon it for equality and equity and justice for all. It is an honor once again to join you all today, and thank you so much. Turn it over.
Good morning. Good morning to the families, to organizations. Congressman couldn't be here. Apologize for that. Congressman was at Naval Base at July 17, along with Secretary of Labor Carlos Del Toro. It took 80 years for that event to finally take place. And here we are. As mentioned, it took 80 minutes of testimony. 80 years later, here we are once again celebrating, although bittersweet, what has happened here. So I will be sure I hear the music, as you mentioned, is coming up here. But what an honor to be here, to be able to celebrate this moment in time. And it, it's American history. So what is amazing, as mentioned before, whoever comes to this point will not only see the beauty of this place, but on the mountaintop, but also read the history. Perhaps in some ways, 80 years of wrongdoing that was corrected. So thank you, and thank you to all the families for 80 years of waiting for peace. Thank you very much.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Dr. Tyler Bamford. I'm an official historian with the Naval History and Heritage Command of the U.S. Navy. It is an honor to be here today to celebrate the unveiling of these panels, which tell the story of the Port Chicago disaster and trial, but also to pay solemn tribute to the U.S. Navy sailors who faced racial discrimination and injustice while performing an essential and extremely hazardous wartime service to their nation. Despite the harsh and unfair treatment that the black sailors at Port Chicago endured, when disaster struck on the night of July 17, 1944, the survivors of that horrific explosion responded with courage that went above and beyond the call of duty. As fires ignited by the explosion broke out among the train cars loaded with ordnance, black sailors ran toward the flames rather than away from them. The commanding officer of Port Chicago told reporters afterwards how a number of these men moved, quote, boldly into a danger area around boxcars loaded with ammunition in order to quell the flames. The commandant of the 12th Naval District similarly praised the African-American sailors at Port Chicago who performed, quote, bravely in the emergency. He declared to reporters that, quote, as real Navy men, they simply carried on in the crisis in accordance with our service's highest traditions. Less than 2 weeks later, however, the very same officers who offered this public praise threatened 258 of these black sailors with imprisonment and even execution when they refused to return to loading ammunition under the command of the same officers who had fostered dangerous working conditions prior to the explosion. When 50 of these black sailors still refused to resume loading ammunition at Port Chicago, it was an act of great courage. Their trial became a rallying cry for the rights of African Americans in uniform, though they were not alone in protesting for equality. Thousands of other African Americans in uniform staged their own protests against unfair treatment during the war. In July of this year, Secretary of the Navy Carlos del Toro set aside the remaining 256 convictions of the Port Chicago sailors due to significant legal errors that compromised the fairness of their trials. But in order to truly right past wrongs, it is not enough to change the record. We must also ensure that the stories of those who suffered and died because of unjust policies are remembered. This monument will do just that by serving as a permanent reminder to all who see it. And when visitors come here, I hope that they not only read the words on these panels, but also feel the significance of this place and reflect that on this very island, black U.S. Navy sailors stood up for their rights. Monuments such as this show our resolve to learn from the past and help ensure that these mistakes are not repeated. And so I want to thank the staff of the Treasure Island Museum, its many partners, and especially Walt Belofsky for being the driving force to honor and remember the Port Chicago sailors through these panels. May they forever serve as a testament to the resolve of the sailors who were unjustly convicted here, and as a reminder to all who see them that equality and justice require, among other things, a willingness on the part of all Americans not to ignore the painful episodes in our history, but rather to acknowledge and constantly work to rectify them. Thank you.
Hi, I'm Walt Belofsky, Vice President of the Treasure Island Museum. And before I start, our board president, Mike Henehane, forgot to thank one person, the person whose leadership keeps the museum organized and moving forward and forming relationships, and my president, Mike Henehane. Thanks, Mike. You know, I wasn't going to tell this story, but there's so many friends here.